He handed me the court summons like he was giving me a receipt. No hesitation, no explanation. Just a white envelope with my full name printed in thick, impersonal font. "You've been served," he said, then walked back to his car. I stood on the porch in my robe and house slippers, the sun barely over the rooftops, and tried to make sense of it. In that single moment, everything I had built, everything I had sacrificed, everything I had given, it all became evidence against me in a courtroom I never wanted to enter. My son, my only son, was suing me. The paper said it was about disturbance of privacy and unwelcome interference in household affairs. I read the sentence twice before it truly landed. This wasn't a neighbor's complaint or a clerical error. It was his handwriting on the attached statement, his lawyer's letterhead, his signature. I sat down on the front step, my knees too weak to keep holding me. The garden hose lay where I'd left it yesterday after watering the roses. The coffee inside the kitchen was getting cold. And the birds, the same ones I used to teach my grandchildren to name, kept chirping, unaware that my world had just been turned inside out. 72 years. That's how long I've been trying to do the right thing. A teacher for 41 of those years, a widow for 19, a mother every single day since I felt that flutter in my belly that I thought was gas. It wasn't. It was Thomas. And now Thomas was dragging me to court. It didn't start like this. Of course not. Nothing this painful ever does. It starts with hope. It starts with love. It starts with a mother believing she can make a difference in her child's life, even when he's grown and has a family of his own. I thought I was doing something beautiful when I moved closer to him. He and Andrea had just had their second baby, and I had some savings from selling my old house in Cedar Hill. The place held too many memories anyway. His father's study, where he used to read the newspaper every Sunday morning, the kitchen where I taught Thomas to make pasta from scratch, the bedroom where I'd watched my husband's breathing slow and then stop. Staying there felt like living in a museum of my own grief. So when Thomas called and told me he and Andrea were expecting their second child, my heart lifted for the first time in months. This was a sign. This was my second chance at being needed, at being essential, at being someone's daily salvation. I found a nice townhouse 5 minutes from theirs. Nothing grand. 1 story, modest kitchen, garden the size of a tablecloth. Perfect for a woman on her own. But I didn't intend to stay on my own. I had plans. I had purpose. When I told Thomas about the townhouse, he sounded hesitant. Even then, I should have noticed. He asked if I was sure. He mentioned that Andrea had just gotten settled in their neighborhood, that her mother lived nearby too, that they had routines established. But I heard only what I wanted to hear, that they needed me, that there was work to be done, that I could be useful again. The day I moved in, Thomas and Andrea helped me bring boxes from the moving truck. Little Marcus, who was 4 years old, asked me why I had so many books. I told him stories were better than toys because they lasted forever. Andrea smiled tightly and said we should probably let Grandma settle in. But I didn't feel the warning in that smile then. I was too busy looking at the baby, Sophia, wrapped in a blanket in her carrier. She was 6 weeks old, and she had Thomas's chin. Every time I looked at her, I saw my boy as a newborn. I saw the future. I saw myself as necessary. That first week, I arranged the townhouse and waited. Not every day, because that would be too much, but most days. I would make a special lunch, pasta with homemade sauce, lasagna from my mother's recipe, chicken soup when the weather turned cool. I would drive over, knock quietly, and offer these gifts of sustenance to them. Andrea's eyes would do that same tight thing when I appeared at the door, but she accepted them. Thomas would hug me, and for those seconds, I felt like I was back in my purpose. Like being a mother wasn't just something I had been, but something I still was. I offered babysitting with genuine enthusiasm. I could watch Marcus while Andrea had a girls' night out. I could hold Sophia while Andrea took a long shower or a nap or did nothing at all if she wanted to. I offered grocery runs. Let me just take your list. I know where everything is at the good store, the one with the prices. I offered walks to the park. I offered to help with the house. I offered and I offered and I offered. In my mind, I was being a good mother, a good grandmother, a good woman. I was filling the space that I had been designed to fill. That's what I told myself in the bright morning moments before doubt could creep in. I tried to stay out of the way. I did. I knew that Thomas was an adult now, that he had built a life with Andrea, that I wasn't supposed to run his household or make decisions about his children. I had read books about adult relationships with aging parents. I had attended a workshop once called Enjoying the Empty Nest, where a woman with frosted hair told us we needed to have our own lives. I believed in those things intellectually, but my hands wanted to fold their clothes. My eyes wanted to scan their kitchen for things they might be missing. My mouth wanted to offer advice about rash creams and sleep schedules and the best way to get stubborn stains out of baby blankets. Something shifted in them over the years. Or maybe I shifted from help to hassle, from comfort to inconvenience. I'm not sure anymore which version is true, because they're both true, and neither of them are enough. Andrea started using that word, boundaries, at first softly, like a warning. "We're trying to set some boundaries," she would say, her voice light, as if she was discussing a menu item at a restaurant. Then sharply, like a wall, the word would come out clipped and final, boundaries. I pretended not to hear. Thomas never corrected her, not once, and his silence was a form of agreement that cut deeper than any of his words could have. There were signs, of course, fewer visits, conversations that felt more like business transactions. When we did see each other, Thomas would check his watch. Andrea would find reasons to be busy. "Oh, I just remembered I have laundry," or "Actually, we have that thing in an hour." The visits that used to last 3 hours began to last 45 minutes. The visits that happened 3 times a week became every other week, then once a week, then sometimes twice a month. I kept a calendar. I marked the dates they came to see me with an X, and I watched the X's become more sparse, like a countdown to disappearance. Birthdays where I was thanked in a group text instead of celebrated with a phone call. That's how you know you've become background noise, when they thank you in bulk to everyone they're messaging at once. "Thanks for the gift, Mom. Marcus loved the toy." Just like that. No call, no personal note, just text. I must have read that message 100 times, trying to find warmth in it, trying to convince myself that the convenience of texting was how young people did things now. Maybe I was old-fashioned to expect more. Maybe I was the problem for wanting to hear his voice. One day, Andrea asked if I could please text before dropping by. "Just so we can make sure the house is in a state for visitors," she said. "I don't want to be caught unprepared." I nodded, smiled, told her of course. I understood completely. I went home and cried into a dish towel for an hour. The dish towel was white linen that my mother had given me years ago, and my tears soaked into it, and I thought about how my mother had cried too, though I had been too young to understand why. Now I knew. We had been the bridges that nobody wanted to cross. We had been the hands that were always reaching out for something that was always just slightly out of reach. But this wasn't another cold shoulder or silent holiday. This was legal. This was official. This was real. I spent the rest of that morning sitting at my small kitchen table, the envelope in front of me like a grenade with the pin pulled. I read the complaint again, slowly. Every word sinking into me like stones dropped into water, each one creating ripples I didn't know how to stop. Repeated intrusions into the private life of the plaintiffs, disruptive presence on the property, psychological pressure and emotional manipulation. Me, a disruptive presence? There was a list. Times I had come over without notice. Times I had stayed too long. Dates and times and annotations, like I was some kind of criminal being tracked. A note about a conversation where I overstepped by commenting on Andrea's parenting. I had suggested that maybe consistency with bedtime would help Sophia sleep better. That wasn't criticism, that was experience. Another note about suggesting the baby needed warmer clothes on a chilly afternoon. I had held Sophia for an hour, and her little fingers were cold, so I mentioned the warmer blanket in the second drawer. Is that manipulation? Is that the crime of a grandmother who loves too much? None of it violent, none of it cruel, just noticed, remembered, documented. Every small gesture, every gentle suggestion, every moment I thought I was helping had been filed away like evidence for a prosecution. And then the line that made me feel like my heart had stopped. The words were typed in Arial font, 12-point, completely impersonal, and absolutely devastating. We are requesting a court-issued no-contact order and reimbursement of funds related to the defendant's unapproved financial involvement. They wanted me gone, and they wanted money. I read that line 3 times, and each time it felt like a slap. The money they wanted reimbursed was love. Every check I had written was an investment in their future, in their happiness, in the belief that Thomas would grow up and understand that his mother had always done her best. The down payment on their first house, that was love. The surprise anniversary trip to Oregon, that was love. The private preschool deposit for Marcus, that was love. I had never told them that I was making a loan. The money had always been given freely, with no conditions, with no expectation of repayment. I had given it because I could, and because I wanted to, and because I thought I was building something that would last. I called no one that day. Not my sister in Tampa, who had always warned me that I was too involved in Thomas's life. Not my neighbor Alice, who still brings me lemons from her yard and asks how the grandchildren are doing. Not even Emma, my granddaughter. That's what I called her before, but according to the papers, she was no longer my granddaughter. She was Marcus, referred to only by his formal name. No terms of endearment, no relationship acknowledged. The child I had held when he was minutes old. The child I had taught to name colors. The child who used to call me Gamma Rose because he couldn't pronounce his R's properly, and it was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. But his mother and father had renamed him in the legal documents, stripped away the nickname that belonged to us, and made him a stranger. I sat at my kitchen table. I drank reheated coffee that tasted like metal and regret. I looked out the window and watched a squirrel tear apart the bird feeder that Thomas had helped me install when I first moved in. He had come over with his tools and his confidence, and together we had mounted it on the fence. He had been proud of how straight it hung. I had been proud of how he still knew how to do things with his hands, how he still had that careful precision that his father had possessed. Now the squirrel was destroying it, and I thought it was probably a metaphor for something. Around 4 p.m., I took out my old filing folder from the cabinet under the microwave. Inside were every check, every transfer, every receipt from the last 15 years. I had organized them chronologically, kept them in plastic sleeves, labeled them carefully. I was a teacher for 41 years. Organization was in my bones. I had documented everything because I wanted to remember, because I wanted to be able to look back and see how much I had given, how much I had loved. Now that documentation was going to be used against me. The court would look at these numbers and see greed. They would look at the amounts and see someone trying to buy love. They would never see the hours I worked overtime to earn this money. They would never see the careful budgeting, the sacrifices, the things I didn't buy for myself so I could buy for them. The down payment on their first house, $30,000. I had worked summer school for 3 years for that money. I had graded papers until midnight. I had canceled vacations. I had told my sister I couldn't afford to visit her in Tampa. Every single dollar of that $30,000 had been wrung out of my life through work and denial. The surprise anniversary trip to Oregon, $5,000. Andrea had always wanted to see the coast, and I had overheard her mention it to her mother. I had researched for weeks, found the perfect bed and breakfast, arranged everything, and surprised them. Thomas's eyes when he found out, it was the first time in months that he had looked at me like I was still his mother and not a stranger he was obligated to tolerate. The private preschool deposit, $1,500. Marcus was struggling with other children, and there was a small school that specialized in social development. For 1 year, his anxiety improved. He made friends. He smiled more. None of it had been alone. It had been love. But maybe somewhere along the way, they stopped seeing it that way. Maybe the money had become a tool in their minds, something that meant I was trying to control them, buy them, manipulate them. Maybe every gift I had given came with invisible strings attached, and they had finally decided they were tired of being puppets. Or maybe I was the one who had attached the strings without realizing it, and I had been pulling them tighter and tighter with every check I wrote, every meal I cooked, every time I showed up at their door. Maybe I had been the problem all along. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, eyes open in the dark, replaying every word I'd ever said that could have been too much. I didn't find many. I was a careful woman, a quiet one. I had spent 41 years in a classroom managing 100 different personalities, learning to read the room, understanding that my words had weight and responsibility. I was not the kind of woman who spoke without thinking. But maybe that was the problem too. Maybe my silence was as dangerous as my words. Maybe by not saying anything when Andrea drew boundaries, I had been disapproving of her. Maybe by accepting their decisions without argument, I had been passive-aggressive. Maybe there was no version of myself that could have done it right. The court date was set for 3 weeks away. 3 weeks to prepare myself to sit in front of a judge and explain why I loved my son. 3 weeks to gather my evidence, my documentation, my proof that I had never been the villain in this story. I hired a lawyer named Gerald Patterson who worked out of a small office above a tax preparation service. His business card had a coffee stain on it when he handed it to me. He was kind enough, but tired. I got the sense he had seen many versions of this story. Aging parents trying to hold on to their children, adult children trying to cut the cord, everyone bleeding from the wounds they inflicted on each other. They're going to paint you as overbearing, he said during our first consultation. That's their strategy. They'll argue that your financial involvement was contingent on maintaining access to the grandchildren, that you used money as a tool to ensure involvement in their lives. But that's not true, I said. I never said they had to let me see the children if they wanted the money. I never once tied the money to access. I know that, Gerald said. He took a sip of his own coffee, and he looked so tired that I wanted to offer to make him something to eat. But they're going to say that it was implied, that a reasonable person would see the pattern and understand that the money was conditional. They're going to make this about your intentions being unclear. My intentions were always clear, I said. I wanted to help them. I wanted to be part of their lives. I wanted to be needed. There it was. Gerald looked at me and nodded. That last part, he said, that part right there, that's going to be the issue, the need. They're going to say that you had an emotional need to be involved in their lives and that the financial contributions were a way of manufacturing that involvement, of making yourself essential to them. Is that really a crime? I asked, to want to be a part of my own son's life? No, Gerald said, but they're going to make it sound like one. I spent the next 3 weeks gathering documentation. Beyond the financial records, I pulled out 20 years of photographs. I made copies of text messages, although Thomas and Andrea had sent very few in recent years. I wrote down everything I could remember, conversations, moments, times I had helped. But as I was writing things down, I began to notice something. The list was short. There weren't as many moments as I thought there had been. After all these years, after all the love I had given, what had I actually received? A handful of photographs, some texts I had initiated, vague memories of holidays, an echo of small voices calling me Gamma Rose. Andrea hired a lawyer too, a woman named Patricia Chen who represented them both. Gerald warned me that Patricia was aggressive, that she would come at me with everything they had. On the morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully in a navy suit that I had bought 5 years ago for a teacher's convention. It hung a bit loose on me now. I had lost weight in the past 3 weeks. I had stopped cooking elaborate meals. I had stopped watering the garden. The roses were starting to wilt. Thomas and Andrea sat on the other side of the courtroom, and I tried not to look at them, but I couldn't help it. I found my eyes moving toward them like plants moving toward the sun. Thomas was wearing a suit too, a gray one that brought out his eyes. He was looking at his hands. Andrea was staring at the judge with a determined expression. They looked like a team. They looked like they were winning. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Eleanor Waters, and she had kind eyes that I wanted to believe would understand my side. Patricia Chen presented their case first, and she made me sound like a monster. She talked about repeated unwanted visits, about boundary violations, about financial coercion masked as generosity. She showed the judge my pattern of appearing at their home, 3 times a week for the first 2 years, twice a week for the next 3 years, once a week for the last 2 years, with sporadic visits between. She showed the judge the financial records and pointed out that the money had been given all at once for major expenses, right after they had announced they were expecting a child, right after they had bought their house, right after they had started looking at private schools. These are classic patterns of control, Patricia said, and I wanted to stand up and tell her that she was wrong, that she was twisting my love into something ugly. But Gerald had warned me not to react. He had told me to sit quietly and let him do the talking. Let him tell the judge that no crime was committed, that a mother loving her son was not a crime. When it was my turn to speak, I told the judge everything. I told her about my marriage and my husband's death. I told her about the years when Thomas was my entire world and how I had loved him so completely that I wasn't sure how to exist in a world where he didn't need me anymore. I told her about the townhouse and the carefully organized help. I told her about the money and how it was never meant to be anything other than a gift. I told her about the boundaries that Andrea had set and how I had respected them, even though respecting them was breaking me apart. I love my son, I said. I have loved him since the moment I knew he existed. I have never stopped loving him. I have never tried to hurt him. I have only ever tried to be his mother. The judge listened. Her kind eyes listened. And then she delivered her ruling. She did not grant the no contact order. She said that there was no evidence of abuse, no evidence of harm, no evidence that my presence in their lives was dangerous. But she did find that there had been boundary violations. She found that I had been overly involved in their private lives, and that my financial contributions had created a dynamic where Thomas and Andrea felt obligated to accept my involvement. She ordered that I could no longer appear at their home without first receiving an invitation. She ordered that I was not to contact them more than once a month. She ordered that I was not to have any unsupervised contact with Marcus and Sophia. The no contact order had been avoided, but I was still being banished. I was being allowed to love my family, but only in the smallest possible way, only in the spaces they designated for me, only on their terms. And there would be no reimbursement of funds for them. But I didn't feel like I had won. I felt like I had lost everything. Thomas left the courtroom first, Andrea's hand in his. He didn't look back. He didn't try to speak to me. There was nothing to say. The judgment had been rendered. The boundaries had been officially established. I was a grandmother to children I could no longer see, a mother to a son I could no longer help, a woman whose love had been tried in a court of law and found to be excessive. Gerald walked me out to my car. He told me that we could appeal, but appeal was expensive, and the judge was unlikely to change her mind. He told me that I could still have a relationship with my family, just within the court's restrictions. He told me that this happened to a lot of families, that it wasn't unusual, that maybe in time they would forgive me. I didn't know what I was supposed to forgive myself for. I had loved. Was that such a terrible crime? The drive home felt longer than 5 minutes. I drove past their house, and I saw the rose bushes in their garden that Thomas had planted 2 springs ago. He had asked me for advice about the best location for them. I had driven him to the nursery to pick them out. Now I had to pass by their house and pretend I couldn't see those roses. I had to pretend I didn't know that Sophia had her first birthday next month. I had to pretend that the boy who called me Gamma Rose didn't exist anymore. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and read the court order again. The language was so clinical, so removed from the reality of what it meant. It was supposed to be simple and clear, but what I heard underneath the legal language was this: you have failed. You have failed at the one thing you were supposed to be good at. You have failed at love. And now you get to spend the rest of your life knowing what you lost. I called my sister in Tampa. I hadn't told her about the court case because I was ashamed. I was ashamed that I couldn't maintain a relationship with my own son. I was ashamed that I had needed him so much that he had to go to court to get away from me. I was ashamed that I had given him money and made him feel like he owed me something. When I called her, I cried for the first time since the hearing. I cried like I was drowning. She didn't try to fix it or tell me it would be okay. She just listened. She just let me fall apart on the phone. You did the best you could, she said finally. You know that, right? You did the best you could with what you had. But what if my best was someone else's worst? What if the love I thought I was giving was actually the thing that was suffocating them? What if I had been so focused on not losing them that I had pushed them away? The first month after the hearing, I didn't call them. I respected the court order. I didn't drive past their house. I didn't send any emails or text messages. I let them have the quiet that they so clearly wanted. But the quiet was deafening. The townhouse that had been filled with my plans and my purpose suddenly felt empty. I went to work. I had gone back to teaching after my husband died, working at a private school for elementary students, and I came home and I sat. I watered the roses even though I wasn't sure why I was bothering. I prepared meals for one person, and it felt like mourning. Alice, my neighbor, began to appear more frequently at my door. She would bring over lemons from her yard, and I think she knew what had happened because the community has a way of knowing these things. You hire a lawyer, you go to court, you disappear into silence for a while. People notice. She didn't ask me what happened. She just brought lemons and asked if I had enough milk and reminded me that there was a book club meeting on Thursday if I wanted to join. I didn't join the book club. I didn't really have the energy to discuss whatever novel they were reading with women I barely knew. But I did start talking to Alice more. I told her the whole story, watching her face carefully to see if she would judge me. She didn't. She had raised 2 children of her own, and she had her own complicated story about boundaries and distance and the way that love could become a weapon if you weren't careful. The thing is, Alice said one afternoon while we were sitting in my small garden, they're both right. You and Thomas, I mean. He's right that he needed space and his own life, and you're right that you were just trying to love him. These things aren't mutually exclusive. People can both be right and still hurt each other. That's not very helpful, I said. I know it's not, Alice said, but I'm old enough to know that most things worth knowing aren't helpful. They're just true. The month ended, and I was allowed to make one call, just one. I waited until I was sure of what I wanted to say, and I called Thomas at work. His secretary told me he was in a meeting, but she took my number and said he would call me back. He didn't call back that day, or the next day. 3 days later, an email arrived from Patricia Chen's office. It said that I had initiated contact that violated the spirit of the court order, and if I continued to try to contact them in ways that hadn't been approved, they would pursue contempt of court charges. One email from a lawyer, and I was reminded that I was being monitored, that my love was being measured against a legal standard and found wanting. The weight I had lost came back, but it came back differently. It settled in my chest like an anchor. I couldn't breathe very well. I had to sit down frequently. I went to see my doctor, and he told me my blood pressure was elevated. He asked if I was under stress. I wanted to laugh because my entire life was stress. My entire existence was the feeling of drowning slowly while everyone watched. I didn't laugh. I just nodded and took the medication he prescribed. Alice invited me to a yoga class. It's good for stress, she said. There's this woman named Cassandra who teaches it, and she's very gentle. Not all that spiritual mumbo-jumbo, just breathing and stretching. I went to yoga. I sat on a mat in a room with 7 other women, most of them older than me, and I tried to touch my toes. My body was stiff. Cassandra told us to breathe into the stiffness, to let our bodies open up in their own time. I breathed and stretched and felt nothing except sad. But I kept going back. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I would show up and lie on a mat and pretend that I was healing, while actually I was just killing time until I died. 2 months after the hearing, I received a phone call. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but I did. It was Thomas. His voice was different than I remembered, or maybe I had just forgotten what he sounded like. "Hi, Mom," he said. "I'm calling to let you know that Andrea is pregnant with our 3rd child." I didn't know what to say. I felt joy and pain existing in the same moment, both equally real. "That's wonderful news," I said finally. "Congratulations to you both." "Thank you," he said. There was a long pause. "Andrea wanted me to tell you that if you wanted to see Marcus and Sophia again, you could come over next Saturday at 2 o'clock. Just for an hour. We thought maybe it was time to loosen things up a bit." I couldn't speak. My throat had closed. I had been waiting for this moment for so long, and now that it was here, I couldn't even manage to say yes. "Mom?" Thomas said. "Are you there?" "I'm here," I whispered. "I would love to see them. I would love to see you." "Okay," he said. "Saturday at 2. Please don't be late, and please understand that the boundaries that were established in court still apply. We're being generous here, and we need you to respect that." I wanted to ask him what he meant. I wanted to ask him what I was supposed to be respecting. But I knew exactly what he meant. I was supposed to be grateful. I was supposed to show up and smile and not ask for more. I was supposed to love them in the precise, measured way that they wanted to be loved, and I was supposed to be happy with whatever scraps they gave me. "I understand," I said. "Thank you for giving me this opportunity." "We'll see you Saturday," he said, and then he hung up. I sat holding the phone for a long time. I looked at my calendar and counted the days until Saturday. It was 4 days away. 4 days until I would see my grandchildren, until I would be able to hold Sophia, if they would let me, until I would be able to look into Marcus's face and see if he still remembered me, or if they had successfully erased me from his memory. I started planning what I would bring. Maybe cookies, the kind that Marcus used to love, the ones with chocolate chips and a hint of lemon zest. Maybe a small gift, but not too much. I didn't want to seem like I was trying to win them back with material things. I didn't want to seem excessive. I wanted to seem appropriate. I wanted to seem like a mother and grandmother who understood the proper boundaries that had been established and was content to exist within them. Saturday came, and I got dressed carefully. Navy slacks and a light blue blouse. Nothing too formal, nothing too casual. I wanted to look like a woman who was comfortable with her role in their lives, even though my hands were shaking as I applied my makeup. I drove over at 1:45, 15 minutes early, and I sat in the car for 10 minutes because I didn't want to seem too eager. I didn't want them to open the door and see a desperate woman. I wanted them to see a woman who respected their boundaries, who understood her limitations, who could accept that she was not the center of their universe anymore. When I knocked on the door, it was Andrea who answered. She smiled, and it wasn't a tight smile this time. It was a real smile, or at least I wanted to believe it was real. "Oh, Helen," she said, and she actually used my first name, which felt like a kindness. "Come in. The kids are so excited to see you." The house was exactly as I remembered it, and completely different. There were new pictures on the walls, pictures I had never seen before. Pictures of Thomas and Andrea and the children, a family narrative that I wasn't a part of. I could see the places in the pictures where I should have been, but wasn't. Every birthday, every holiday, every moment that mattered, there were empty spaces where I should have been standing. Marcus saw me and his face lit up. "Gamma Rose!" he yelled, and he ran toward me. I knelt down to meet him, and he threw his arms around my neck. "You came to see us?" I said. "Of course I came to see you," I said. "I have missed you so much." He held on to me for a moment, and then he pulled back. "Mommy said you were busy. Mommy said you couldn't come visit for a while because you needed to learn about boundaries." The words came out of his mouth like they had been rehearsed, like he had been prepared to deliver them. I looked up at Andrea, and she was looking away, pretending not to hear. Sophia was in a playpen in the corner, and she looked at me with the uncertain expression of a toddler who doesn't quite remember who I am. "Well," I said to Marcus, "I'm not busy anymore, and I understand about boundaries now, so I'm going to try to come see you more often. Would you like that?" "Yes," he said. "Can we read stories?" "Of course we can read stories," I said. "That's my favorite thing to do with you." The hour went by so quickly. We read 3 books, I helped Sophia play with blocks, and she called me Gamma in a small voice that was slightly different from Marcus's version. Thomas appeared and disappeared, mostly staying in another room. Andrea brought out refreshments, lemonade and cookies that weren't the ones I had made. We sat together in their living room, and I tried to memorize everything because I didn't know when I would see them again. I tried to memorize the way the afternoon light came through the windows. I tried to memorize the specific laugh that Marcus had developed in the time since I had seen him last. I tried to memorize Sophia's weight in my arms. I tried to memorize the feeling of being allowed, just barely, to be a grandmother. When my hour was up, Andrea walked me to the door. "This was nice," she said. "I think maybe we were too harsh before. Maybe we can figure out a way to make this work that works for everyone." "I would like that very much," I said. "Next month," she said. "Same time. We'll do this again." I went home and I called Alice. I told her everything, and I cried tears that were both happy and sad, because I was getting my grandchildren back, but I was getting them back in tiny, measured increments, and it was still not enough, and I was not sure it would ever be enough. The monthly visits became my entire life. I would plan for them, cook for them, prepare myself mentally for the constraints. Thomas and Andrea set up rules. I could see the children once a month for 1 hour. I could not give them presents without approval. I could not discuss the court case or the boundaries with them. I could not try to spend time with Thomas and Andrea without the children present. When I violated these rules, and I did, because they were so many and so specific, Patricia Chen would send me a letter reminding me of the court order. Every letter felt like a slap. One day, I brought Marcus a book that I had written when I was his age. It was a story about a little boy who went on adventures with his grandmother. I had illustrated it, and the drawings were crude, but they were genuine. I thought he would like it. But when I gave it to him, Andrea took it from his hands. "We need to approve gifts before they come into the house," she said. "I'll look at this and let you know if it's appropriate." I never got the book back. She sent me a note that said the book was too personal, that it blurred the boundaries between grandmother and parent, that she needed to maintain control over the narratives that the children were exposed to. I understood then that the boundaries were not just about frequency of contact. They were about ownership. They were about control. They were about who got to define the relationship that I had with my grandchildren. And it was not me. Still, I went back every month. I sat in their living room and read the books they approved. I played the games they designated as appropriate. I answered the questions that Marcus asked about his grandfather, the man he never met but who had contributed half of who he was. I watched Sophia grow and develop and become more of a person, and I was allowed to witness these moments in small, carefully controlled portions. A year went by, then 2 years, then 3. In that time, I watched my grandchildren grow through these monthly 1-hour visits. Marcus was starting school. Sophia was starting to talk in full sentences. And Thomas and Andrea's third baby was born, a little girl named Claire. I was allowed to meet her once when she was 3 weeks old. The visit was at the hospital, and I had to sit in a waiting room for 20 minutes before they came to get me. I was allowed to hold the baby for 15 minutes. Then I was asked to leave because Andrea needed to rest. I was aging rapidly. My doctor told me my blood pressure was still elevated. My hair had turned completely gray, and I hadn't bothered to dye it anymore. There wasn't a point. There was no one I was trying to look good for. I went to school and taught my students about reading and writing and the importance of expressing yourself. I went to yoga with Alice. I went to book club. I went to my monthly visits with my grandchildren. And I went home to my townhouse, and I existed in a state of suspended animation, waiting for something I couldn't name. 5 years after the court case, Alice died. She had a heart attack while gardening, and she was found by her son when he came to check on her. I went to the funeral, and I sat with people I barely knew, and I realized that I had lost my only friend. In my eagerness to maintain my relationship with my grandchildren within the parameters that had been established, I had let every other relationship in my life atrophy. I had no one to call when I was sad. I had no one who knew my whole story. I had only Alice, and now I didn't have her. That night, I sat in my townhouse and I realized that I was going to die there. I was going to live out the rest of my life in this small 1-story house 5 minutes away from a son who barely spoke to me, raising my grandchildren in 1-hour monthly increments, and when I died, no one would know how to organize my funeral. Thomas and Andrea would probably feel obligated to attend because it was their responsibility, but they wouldn't cry. They would sit in the front row, and they would be relieved that the boundary problem had been solved permanently. I didn't want to die like that. I didn't want to die with my love unexpressed and unreciprocated. I didn't want to die in a state of suspended animation, waiting for crumbs of affection that never quite satisfied my hunger. So I decided to write. I decided to write the whole story, the whole truth, everything that had happened to me and everything that I was feeling. I decided to write it not for Thomas and Andrea, because they had already made clear that they didn't want to hear from me. I decided to write it for my grandchildren so that someday, when they were old enough to understand, they would know the truth about why their grandmother had to love them from a distance. I started writing in the evenings after school. I filled notebook after notebook with my words, my memories, my recriminations and my explanations, and my justifications and my apologies. I wrote about my husband's death and the way it had hollowed me out. I wrote about the months after Thomas was born when I thought I would finally be happy and how wrong I had been about what would make me happy. I wrote about my years as a teacher and the way that I had learned to hide my emotions behind a professional mask. I wrote about the financial contributions and what they had meant to me, not purchases, but investments in a version of myself that I desperately wanted to be, a version that was needed and wanted and essential. I wrote about the court case and the way that love had been criminalized. I wrote about the boundaries and the way they had felt like prison walls. I wrote about the monthly visits and the way they had been the only thing keeping me alive. I wrote, and somewhere in the writing, I began to understand that I had done exactly what they had accused me of doing. I had used my love as a tool. I had made my relationship with them dependent on their acceptance of my involvement in their lives. I had confused my need to be needed with genuine interest in their well-being. I had been the villain in my own story, even though I had never wanted to be. This understanding didn't make things better. It made things worse. It made me realize that the court had been right to establish boundaries. It made me realize that Thomas and Andrea had been right to want distance. It made me realize that my love, as genuine as it was, had been suffocating and controlling and toxic. And this realization made me want to die even more than I had before, because now I couldn't even comfort myself with the thought that I had been right. Thomas called one day. This was unusual. Our contact was so minimal that a phone call was a disruption of routine. "Hi, Mom," he said. "I'm calling about next month's visit. Can you do Saturday at 2 o'clock?" "Yes," I said, "of course." "There's something we want to talk to you about," he said. "Andrea and I have been talking, and we think it's time that you knew about some things." My heart stopped. They were going to cut me off completely. They had finally decided that even the minimal contact wasn't worth it anymore. They were going to tell me that the monthly visits needed to stop. I had known this was coming. I had been waiting for it. "Okay," I said, "I'll be there." When Saturday came, I was a bundle of nerves. I had barely eaten. I had barely slept. I drove over and I knocked on the door. And when Andrea answered, she looked different. Her expression was softer than it had been in years. "Come in," she said, and she put her arm around me. The touch was so unexpected that I almost fell over. Thomas was in the living room, and he stood up when I came in. He looked older than I remembered, or maybe I was just noticing things about him that I had been too anxious to notice before. He had lines around his eyes like he was always squinting. His hair was starting to gray at the temples. He looked like a man who carried weight that he wasn't sure how to put down. "Hi, Mom," he said. "Thank you for coming." "Of course," I said. "Is everything okay?" They gestured to the couch and I sat down. Thomas and Andrea sat across from me on the opposite couch and they held hands. I had a moment of panic where I thought they were going to tell me that they were moving, that they were taking the children far away where I would never see them again. "We want to apologize," Andrea said. I must have looked confused because she continued. "For the way we handled things, for the court case, for all of it, we owe you an apology." I didn't understand. This wasn't the conversation I was prepared for. I was prepared to be told that I was not welcome anymore. I was prepared for finality. I was not prepared for this. "I don't understand," I said. "We've been in therapy," Thomas said, "both of us, individually and as a couple, and our therapist helped us understand that we handled things badly. We were hurt by some of the boundaries we perceived you crossing, and instead of talking to you about it, we let it build up until we exploded. And then we escalated everything by going to court instead of trying to have a conversation. The money," Andrea said, "we know now that you gave it out of love, not out of a desire to control us. We were wrong to request reimbursement. We were hurt, and we took that hurt out on you." I started to cry. I couldn't help it. I had spent 5 years waiting for them to acknowledge that they had been unfair, and now that they were doing it, I couldn't process it. I couldn't believe it was real. "We also want you to know about Marcus," Thomas said. "He's old enough now that we've started to tell him the truth about why you can only visit once a month. We've explained that boundaries are important, but we may have been too strict about them. He misses you. He asks about you all the time. And Sophia," Andrea added, "she barely remembers you. We regret that. We regret that you've missed so much of her childhood because of our anger." "I don't know what to say," I said. "I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful that you're willing to give me another chance." "We're not sure exactly what the next phase looks like," Thomas said, "but we think that if the court order allows for it, maybe you could have more regular contact. Maybe you could come for dinner sometimes. Maybe you could help with childcare occasionally."
We're not going to undo the legal arrangements, but we're going to try to work within them more generously than we have been. I would like that very much, I said, and I want you to know that I understand now why you felt the need to establish boundaries. I was too involved. I was using my involvement to fill a hole in myself, and that wasn't fair to you or to your family. I'm sorry for that. I'm truly sorry. Thomas came over and he hugged me. It was the first real hug we had exchanged in 5 years. I had hugged him dozens of times in that 5 years, but they had been quick hugs, tentative hugs, hugs that were offered when he wasn't sure how to refuse them. This hug was different. This hug was his choice. This hug meant something. Over the next year, things slowly began to normalize. I started having dinner with them twice a month instead of just one visit. I was allowed to text Marcus occasionally, though nothing too personal. I was allowed to help with childcare when Andrea needed a break. It was still not the relationship that I had wanted before the court case, but it was better than what I had been living with for 5 years. It was a relationship that existed in the real world, with real boundaries, but also with real affection. Marcus started to see me as his grandmother again. He would run to the door when I arrived. He would tell me about school and his friends and the things he was learning. One day, he asked me why I hadn't come to visit for so long. I didn't know how to explain the court case to a child. I didn't know how to tell him that his mother and I had been so hurt that we had had to ask a judge to help us figure out how to love each other. Your parents and I had a disagreement, I said, but we worked through it and now everything is better. And I'm going to try to come see you as often as I can. He seemed satisfied with that answer. Children are remarkably forgiving when they're given half a chance to be. Sophia, who had been so young during those 5 years of distance, began to develop a relationship with me that was less burdened by history. She didn't remember the court case or the 1-hour visits. She just knew me as her grandmother who came to dinner and helped her with puzzles and told her stories about her grandfather. She was like a clean slate, a chance to do things differently, to love without the weight of previous mistakes. Claire, the youngest, had never known anything but the newer, gentler version of my involvement in their lives. She saw me as simply a woman who was part of her world, who loved her, who was present. There was no trauma in our relationship. There was no history of boundary violations. There was just a grandmother and a granddaughter learning to know each other. I continued to teach until I turned 68. My doctor suggested that it was time to step back, that my heart needed the rest. I had worked for 41 years, and I had given everything I had to my students and my profession. It was time to let someone else carry that weight. The last class I taught was filled with tears from both my students and myself. They gave me a gift, a quilt where each student had embroidered something about our time together. I hung it on my wall, and I looked at it every day, remembering the young faces that had trusted me to guide them through the world of words and stories. In retirement, I had more time to spend with my family. Thomas and I began to have real conversations about life and loss and the things that had happened between us. He told me that he had been scared of me when I was so involved in his life. He told me that he felt like he could never do anything right because I was always there, watching, suggesting, trying to help. He told me that he had felt suffocated, and the only way he could breathe was to push me away completely. I'm sorry that I made you feel that way, I said. I'm sorry that I handled it so badly, he said. I could have just talked to you about it. I could have asked you to back off instead of going to court. We both made mistakes, I said. The important thing is that we're trying to do better now. Andrea and I also began to build a better relationship. She told me that she had felt like I was judging her as a mother, that my suggestions about how to raise the children felt like criticism. She told me that she had wanted to prove to me that she could do it without my help. She told me that the financial support had felt like it came with invisible expectations of gratitude and compliance. I never meant for it to feel that way, I said. I was just trying to help. I know that now, she said. I was scared and defensive, and I took it out on you. I'm sorry.
We didn't become best friends, but we became something more than adversaries. We became two women who had been hurt by misunderstanding and had slowly learned to see each other clearly. In my last years of teaching, I had started to write down my thoughts about aging and family relationships and the way that love could go wrong even when everyone's intentions were good. I had filled many notebooks with reflections, observations, and stories. After I retired, I began to organize these writings into a cohesive narrative. I spent my mornings writing, my afternoons with my grandchildren, my evenings reading and thinking about what it all meant. I wanted to write something that would help other aging parents understand what I had learned. I wanted to write something that would help adult children understand the fear and vulnerability that comes with aging. I wanted to write something that would help families navigate the complicated terrain of boundaries and love. But I also wanted to write something that was honest about my own failings, about the ways I had used my love as a weapon, about the ways I had confused what I needed with what was good for my children. The book I eventually wrote was not a guide or a self-help manual. It was simply a story. It was the story of how I had almost lost my son and my grandchildren because I loved them too much and not well. It was the story of a court case and legal boundaries and the year I spent in what felt like exile. It was the story of how slowly, over time, we learned to love each other in a healthier way. I didn't write it to be published. I wrote it for Marcus and Sophia and Claire so that when they were old enough to understand, they would know the truth about their grandmother. I wrote it so that they would understand that sometimes people hurt each other, not because they want to, but because they don't know how to do it differently. I wrote it so that they would know that it's possible to repair things, even when they seem irreparably broken. Thomas found the manuscript in my study one day when he was helping me organize some files. He asked if he could read it. I was nervous about letting him read it because I was worried that he would see too much of himself in it, that he would feel blamed or criticized. But I let him read it anyway because I thought he deserved to know the whole story from my perspective. He came back to me a week later with tears in his eyes. "I didn't realize how much I hurt you," he said. "Reading this, I realized that you were suffering all those years. I was so focused on how hurt I was that I never thought about what you were going through." "You were hurt because I made you hurt," I said. "I have to take responsibility for that." "But I handled it so badly," he said. "I should have tried harder to talk to you instead of just cutting you off and then escalating to court." "We both should have tried harder," I said, "but we didn't know how, and we're trying now. That's what matters." Thomas asked me if he could share the manuscript with Andrea. I told him he could. When Andrea read it, she called me and asked if we could have coffee, just the two of us. We met at a small cafe near my townhouse, and we sat in a corner booth and talked for 2 hours. She told me about her own mother and the complicated relationship they had. She told me about her fear that she would replicate that same dynamic with me. She told me about the ways that she had projected her own issues onto me. "I think I need to apologize for some things," she said. "I think I was very harsh with you, and I don't think I always gave you a fair chance to change." "I also think I need to apologize," I said. "I think I was controlling, even when I didn't mean to be. I think I was so focused on being needed that I never asked what you actually wanted from me." "So where do we go from here?" she asked. "I think we keep doing what we're doing," I said. "We have dinner twice a month. We work on our relationship slowly. We try to be honest with each other about what we need and what we're feeling. We don't pretend that the court case didn't happen, but we also don't let it define the rest of our relationship. I'd like that." The last years of my life were good years. I spent time with my family. I watched my grandchildren grow. Marcus became a reader, and I gave him books that I thought he would love, and we would talk about them together. Sophia became an artist, and I went to her school shows and watched her display her paintings. Claire became a dancer, and I sat in audience seats and watched her move across stages with grace and confidence. I was allowed to be part of their lives in real and meaningful ways. I was allowed to love them freely. Thomas and I never fully talked about the money I had given them, but one day he brought me a check. "It's not the full amount," he said, "but we've paid back what we could. We're sorry that we escalated things the way we did." I looked at the check and I refused it. "Keep it," I said. "Every cent of that money was given because I wanted to give it. It was never a loan. I never expected it back." "But the court—" "The court order is not going to change how I feel," I said. "That money was love, and you can't pay back love. You can only receive it or reject it." He took the check back and folded it into his pocket. I don't know if he kept it or destroyed it, and I never asked. I turned 80 years old on a Tuesday in March. Thomas and Andrea had organized a small party at their house. My sister came down from Tampa. Some of my friends from the yoga studio came. My grandchildren presented me with a photo album that they had made, with pictures from over the years. Some of the pictures were from the 5-year period when I had only seen them once a month, and looking at those pictures now, I realized how much I had missed. I had missed so much of their lives. But I was there now, and that would have to be enough. That night, after everyone had gone home, I sat in my townhouse and thought about my life. I thought about my marriage and my husband and the way he had loved me completely. I thought about raising Thomas as a single mother after his death, and all the ways I had tried to make up for his absence. I thought about the years when I taught and the thousands of students whose lives I had touched. I thought about the court case and the way it had broken something in me that could never be fully repaired. And I thought about the slow reconciliation that had happened over the following years, the way that love and patience and a willingness to see the other person's side could begin to heal even the deepest wounds. I was not the same woman who had received that court summons on my porch 40 years ago. I was more tired. I was sadder. I had learned that love was not enough, that it took more than love to make a family work. It took communication and boundaries and a willingness to respect the other person's need for space. It took humility and honesty and a willingness to admit when you were wrong. But I was also wiser. I understood now what I had learned in the years after my son's death, but forgotten in my desperation to be needed. I understood that the best thing I could do for my son was to let him live his own life, to make his own mistakes, to build his own family on his own terms. I understood that my role as a mother didn't end when he became an adult, but it changed. It became less about control and influence and more about support and presence. It became about being available without being intrusive, about being there without taking up all the oxygen in the room. I made a decision then, sitting in my quiet townhouse with a garden outside that I had spent so many years tending. I decided that I was going to live the time I had left fully. I was going to spend time with my family. I was going to read the books I had always wanted to read. I was going to travel, even though I was old and my body didn't move the way it used to. I was going to write. I was going to love fiercely, but respectfully. I was going to live like a woman who understood that time was finite and that wasting it on regret was a form of suicide. The next summer, I took my first real vacation in decades. Thomas and Andrea and the children came with me. We rented a house near the ocean, and we spent a week together doing nothing in particular. We took walks on the beach, we read books in the shade, we played games, we ate ice cream. My grandchildren built sandcastles and ran in the waves, and I sat in a beach chair and watched them. This was what I had wanted all along. This ease, this simplicity, this freedom from the need to be doing something or helping with something or being involved in something. Just being together was enough. One afternoon, Marcus came to sit with me. He was 9 years old by then, growing into a young man, developing his own opinions and his own identity. He asked me to tell him about his grandfather, the man he never knew. So I told him stories. I told him about my husband's patience. I told him about the way he had loved books and numbers and the smell of rain. I told him that Marcus was named after his grandfather, and that his grandfather's spirit lived in him, in the way he loved to read, in the way he was thoughtful about the world. "I wish I could have met him," Marcus said.
So do I said. But he would have been so proud of you. He would have loved you so much. Did he love you? Marcus asked. It was such a simple question, but it contained so much weight. Yes, I said. He loved me, and I loved him. And even though he's been gone for a long time, that love is still here. It's in my memory, it's in you. Marcus thought about this for a moment, and then he asked me, "Did you love Mom and Dad before you hurt them?" I had to take a breath before I could answer. Yes, I said. I loved them very much, and I still do. But sometimes when we love people, we love them in ways that aren't helpful. Sometimes we love them too much, or we love them in ways that make them feel trapped instead of free. But they forgave you, Marcus said. They did, I said, and I'm very grateful for that. I'm glad, Marcus said, and then he went back to building his sandcastle. That night, I stood on the balcony of the house and looked out at the ocean. The waves kept coming and going, just like time kept moving forward, just like life kept happening. I had spent so much of my life trying to hold on to things: my husband, my son, my role as a mother and grandmother. I had tried to make everything permanent, to preserve things in amber so they could never change or leave me. And in doing so, I had only driven people away. Now I was learning to let go. I was learning to allow things to change and grow and move. I was learning to be present with what I had without grasping for more. It was harder than I thought it would be, but it was also more peaceful. I lived for several more years after that, watching my grandchildren grow and change. Marcus became a teenager. Sophia became more confident in her art. Claire became more serious about her dancing. And I was there for all of it in a way that was appropriate and healthy and based on genuine interest in their lives rather than on my need to be needed. I also reconnected with my sister. She had always been there, even when I was too caught up in my drama with Thomas to remember that I had a sister. After Alice died, my sister became my closest friend. We talked on the phone regularly. We saw each other whenever we could. We had long conversations about our lives and our regrets and the things we wished we had done differently. I also volunteered. After retirement, I had extra time, and I used some of that time to volunteer at the local elementary school, working with struggling readers. I worked with children who reminded me of the thousands of students I had taught over 41 years. I worked with children who needed to know that someone believed in them, that someone thought they were worthy of attention and care. This work reminded me why I had gone into teaching in the first place. It wasn't about being needed, it was about making a difference. And there was a difference between those two things, and I had spent many years confusing them. When I was 92 years old, I had a stroke. It wasn't a major stroke, but it was a warning. My body was failing me, and I needed to make peace with that fact. I went into a rehabilitation center for a few weeks, and when I came out, I knew that I was in the beginning of the end. I had maybe a few more years, maybe not. Time was no longer something I could count on having an abundance of. Thomas and I had a conversation about my wishes for end-of-life care. I told him that I didn't want to be resuscitated if my heart stopped. I told him that I didn't want to spend my last days in a hospital bed with tubes in my body. I told him that I wanted to die at home, surrounded by people I loved, or I wanted to die alone, and either would be acceptable to me. "Don't talk like that," he said. "You're going to live for many more years." "I might," I said, "but I want to be prepared if I don't. And I want you to know that I've made peace with my life. I've made peace with the mistakes I made with you. I've made peace with the way I loved you, even when that love wasn't healthy. I've made peace with the fact that I can't control you or your life or your children's lives. And I want you to know that I'm grateful for the time we spent reconciling. I'm grateful for the second chance." He started to cry. "I'm sorry," he said, "for everything, for the court case, for the distance, for all of it. I'm sorry too," I said, "but we worked through it, and that's what matters. We didn't give up on each other. We didn't accept the distance as permanent. We fought our way back to each other."
Over the next few years, I got weaker. My memory began to go. Some days I didn't remember that my husband was dead. Some days I thought Marcus was still a little boy. Some days I forgot that there had been a court case at all. These lapses in memory were sometimes painful because I would remember the court case again for the first time, as if it had just happened. But mostly, they were a mercy. They allowed me to forget the worst parts and focus on the good parts, the love, the family, the sense of being connected to people who mattered. I died on a Tuesday in November, in my own bed, with Thomas sitting beside me. My sister was there, Andrea was there, the grandchildren were there. We had spent the day talking about memories, my husband, my teaching career, the years of raising Thomas alone, the difficult times and the good times. I had told them stories about my childhood, about my parents, about the things that had shaped me into the woman I became. And as the sun was setting, I simply closed my eyes and didn't open them again. At my funeral, Thomas gave a eulogy. He talked about his mother's dedication to her work as a teacher. He talked about her fierce love for her family. He talked about the difficulties we had faced and the way we had overcome them. He talked about the example she had set for him about forgiveness and reconciliation and the willingness to try again even when things seemed hopeless. My mother was not a perfect woman, he said, but she was a good woman. She loved deeply, sometimes too deeply, but she learned to love better. And that's what I want to be remembered about her. Not the mistakes she made, but her willingness to acknowledge them, to change, and to keep trying. Marcus, who was now in college, wrote a letter that was read at the service. He wrote about being a little boy and having a grandmother who knew all his favorite stories. He wrote about the distance that came and not understanding why. He wrote about his grandmother coming back into his life when he was old enough to understand more about the complexity of relationships. He wrote about loving a woman who had made mistakes but who had also worked hard to be better. After the service, people came up to Thomas and told him their stories about his mother. Former students came and talked about how she had changed their lives. Parents of former students came and talked about the impact she had had on their children. People from my yoga class came and talked about the strength they had seen in me. The congregation was full of people whose lives I had touched in small or large ways. And I think Thomas realized then that his mother had been more than just a woman who was too involved in his life. She had been a teacher, a friend, a member of a community. She had mattered in ways that he hadn't fully understood. In the weeks and months after my death, Thomas and Andrea did something that surprised everyone. They contacted Patricia Chin, the lawyer who had represented them in the court case against me, and they asked her about the possibility of sealing or expunging the case from the record. Patricia told them that it was possible, though it would require some legal work. They decided to do it. They wanted to make sure that the court case didn't follow my memory, didn't define what people knew about me, didn't become the dominant narrative of who I was. When the case was sealed, my family felt like they were finally able to close a chapter that had been open for too long. They were able to remember me without also remembering the pain and anger and hurt that had accompanied the court case. They were able to focus on the reconciliation that had come after rather than on the conflict that had come before. But they also kept the lessons. They learned from what had happened between us. Thomas and Andrea became more intentional about communicating with their own children. They talked to Marcus and Sophia and Claire about boundaries and about expectations. They tried to model a kind of love that was healthy and respectful and that didn't require anyone to lose their sense of self. They tried to be better than what had happened to them. And when they were old and their own children grew into adults, Thomas and Andrea tried to apply what they had learned. They maintained relationships with their adult children that were based on mutual respect and clear communication. They offered help when it was wanted, and they stepped back when it was needed. They tried to love their grandchildren, but they also tried to do it in a way that honored the parents' desire to raise their own children without interference. This is what my court case ultimately taught them. Not that all mothers are bad, not that aging parents are inherently controlling, not that families are doomed to conflict. Instead, it taught them that love was complicated. It taught them that good intentions were not enough. It taught them that communication was more important than distance. It taught them that forgiveness was possible, even in situations that seemed impossible. And it taught them that the most important thing a person could do was to be willing to look at themselves honestly and to change when change was needed. The story of my court case spread through the family like all good stories do. It became a cautionary tale and a redemptive tale simultaneously. It was a warning about the dangers of boundary violations and emotional enmeshment. But it was also a testament to the possibility of reconciliation and healing. And when Thomas's grandchildren grew old enough to understand, they heard the story. They understood that their great-grandmother had loved fiercely and not always wisely, but that she had ultimately been a woman of integrity who was willing to admit her mistakes and work toward change. Some families look at a story like this and they see only cautionary markers, things to be afraid of, warning signs to watch for. But the best families are the ones that look at it and see both the danger and the opportunity. They see that yes, love can go wrong, but they also see that wrong love can be transformed into right love if people are willing to do the work. They see that yes, conflict can tear families apart, but they also see that conflict can bring people together if they're willing to be honest about what went wrong. My life was not the life I planned. I thought I would have a long marriage and that my husband and I would grow old together. I thought I would be a teacher and then retire and spend time traveling and reading. I thought my relationship with my son would continue to be central to my identity even after he became an adult. I thought that love would be enough to hold us all together. But life is not about having things go according to plan. Life is about showing up for what actually happens. Life is about adjusting your expectations when reality doesn't match them. Life is about learning to love people in the way they need to be loved, rather than in the way you want to love them. Life is about being willing to be wrong, to admit it, and to change. I was 94 years old when I died. I had lived a long life, I had loved deeply, I had made mistakes, I had suffered, I had achieved some measure of redemption. I had reconciled with the people I loved most. And in the end, I think that was enough. I think that the arc of my life, taken as a whole, was not a tragedy, but a complex and nuanced story about what it means to be human, to be vulnerable, to be willing to change. Thomas would later tell his own children that he wished he could have done more to honor his mother while she was still alive. He wished he could have understood sooner the fear that came with aging, the loss of identity that came with the end of an active career, the desperate grasping for relevance that comes when you realize that time is finite. He wished he could have communicated more openly instead of letting resentment build up until there was no other option but to go to court. But he also recognized that he had been in pain, that his boundaries had been necessary for his health and well-being, that the court case had been a form of communication when communication had seemed impossible. And he recognized that I had eventually understood this too. He recognized that we had both done the best we could with the knowledge we had at the time. And he recognized that the years we had spent together after the reconciliation had been good years, healing years, years that had allowed both of us to die with fewer regrets than we might have otherwise had. This is the story that Thomas told his children and his grandchildren. This is the story that shaped how they understood family and conflict and the possibility of resolution. This is the story that taught them that love was not simple, that family was not easy, but that both were worth fighting for. And this is the story that I wish I could have written more clearly while I was alive, so that everyone who knew me would have understood not just what happened to me, but why it happened and how I grew from it. The lessons of my story are not unique to me. They are lessons that many families are learning, are struggling with, are fighting about. They are lessons about the proper distance between adult children and aging parents. They are lessons about the way that financial support can become a tool of control without anyone meaning for it to happen.
They are lessons about boundaries and respect, and the complicated terrain of family obligations versus personal autonomy. They are lessons about what happens when love goes wrong and what happens when we try to fix it. But perhaps the most important lesson is this: it is never too late to change, to apologize, to try again. My family could have stayed broken. Thomas and I could have gone to the grave not speaking. My grandchildren could have lived their lives without knowing their grandmother. But instead, we chose reconciliation. We chose to try. And in choosing reconciliation, we gave ourselves the gift of each other. We gave ourselves the gift of time together. We gave ourselves the gift of forgiveness. This is the true story of my life, the story that began with a court summons and ended with a family transformed by the willingness to see each other clearly and to love each other better. This is the story of a mother and a son, of a grandmother and her grandchildren, of a family that broke and then slowly, carefully healed itself. This is the story of what love looks like when we finally get it right.